Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's MarkMonitor webinar, Phishing Attacks in the Cloud, Effective Strategies to Protect Your Brand, where we'll be reviewing the current online landscape, the real business impact of attacks on cloud-based companies, and best practices and considerations to effectively safeguard your organization from phishing attacks. Before we begin our presentation, I'd like to run everyone through a few housekeeping items. During today's webinar, only the host will be able to see the list of all attendees. All participants' lines will be muted to ensure there was no background noise. Following our presentation, we will be holding a Q&A session. If you have a question at any time for our speaker during the presentation, feel free to submit it using the Q&A tab located on your screen. You can also submit your questions at the end of the session. For any questions our speaker won't have time to answer today, we'll make sure to follow up with you after the event. We are recording today's webinar, and we plan to send out a follow-up email to all registrants with a link to the recording and presentation slides within the next couple of days. With that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today's presentation. We are joined by MarkMonitor brand protection expert, Akino Chikada. Akino is a senior product marketing manager for the MarkMonitor brand protection solution. She started her career in public relations and marketing in London and has worked in Europe, Asia, and the United States. She has led and served interim roles in global marketing strategies, product marketing, events management, public relations, corporate communications, and regional marketing. Akino holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University College of London, a Master of Science from the London School of Economics, and has trilingual fluency in English, Italian, and Japanese. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Akino to get us started.
Thank you, Gina. So today, we'll talk about the online fraud lifecycle and trends, how fraudsters are targeting SaaS and cloud-based companies. We'll also talk about how fraudsters monetize and the business impact this has. And we'll also talk about considerations and best practices for SaaS companies. Lastly, as Gina mentioned, we'll have a Q&A session. So, since we are talking about the online fraud, I thought I'd start with a very high-level overview and look at the global internet adoption. In 1995, less than 1% of the population was connected to the internet, and today, approximately 40% of the world is connected. And by end of 2015, it's forecasted that 3.2 billion people will be using the internet. And while this is great in so many different ways, there is the flip side to it, which is it also often opens up opportunities for fraudsters to conduct some fraudulent activities. So let's look at the online life cycle. At a very high level, there are three phases. The first phase is the setup phase. So it's the setup of the phishing attack. The fraudsters purchasing domains, they're setting up their email campaigns, and they're pretty much just getting ready for the second phase, which is the launching of the phishing campaign. The launching is actually where the fraudsters proactively promoting their phishing campaign. And the last phase is obviously the ultimate end goal, which is to collect credentials and monetize. Traditionally, the financial industry has always been the primary target for phishing attacks, and that's still very much the case. Financial industry is still a primary target, and during the first half of 2015, approximately 41% of the phishing attacks was targeted to the financial industry. So the moral of the story here is financial institutions should still continue to maintain a proactive anti-phishing or anti-fraud strategy. What's really interesting is that today, fraudsters are actually evolving their targets, and they're targeting beyond the financial institutions. So look at this chart on the screen. The chart shows that we removed all financial institutions and we looked at other key industries. And since 2014, January 2014, we see that phishing activity has practically quadrupled. The point here is that, industries that probably probably never even thought that they were a phishing target. Well, I think that they should reconsider and maybe double check to see that and make sure that there are still no phishing attacks happening within those industries, because these stats are really hard to ignore, and it's really interesting to see where the trend is going. One area that we found particularly interesting is the cloud and SaaS. Before I get into explaining why cloud and SaaS companies, thought we'd start by defining it. So the cloud is synonymous to online, and it's basically a way of delivering data to any digital device, anywhere and at any time. The cloud is prevalent in our lifestyle, and according to the Consumer Electronics Association, 96% of the adults in the U.S. are currently using some form of cloud services. And within that, SaaS is the most predominant type of cloud computing. SaaS stands for Software as a Service, and it's basically software that is owned and managed remotely by a provider that delivers their software to users remotely at any time. They're often in pay-as-you-go or subscription-based, and it could be either B2B or B2C. And many companies have adopted a SaaS model because it has many advantages, including accessibility, scalability, security, reliability, and APIs. So lots and lots of advantages for using SaaS. So let's talk about why SaaS, and why are we talking about SaaS companies? Well, fraudsters tend to follow opportunities where they can make a lot of money and profit. And they tend to stay ahead of the curve and be part of the trendsetters. So if we look at how much money has been invested, so funding for SaaS companies was $11.7 billion in 2014. That's 70% over the past year. And since 2011, funding has tripled. Also, a third of businesses worldwide are moving applications from locally hosted servers to SaaS environments. And if that's not impressive enough, this last statistics is also staggering. Global SaaS software revenues are forecasted to reach $106 billion in 2016, increasing 21% over projected 2015 spending level. So all in all, with this shift, it definitely, SaaS introduces new concerns and data theft opportunities. So SAS model changes the fraudster's target. Traditionally, fraudsters focus on targeting the infrastructure itself to penetrate and break in. However, with the SAS models, fraudsters are targeting the users because they also have access rights to the data. Users are now also responsible to ensure security measures. The problem is individual users of SaaS apps don't tend to have the appropriate security controls in place to fully minimize the risk. And therefore, phishing becomes a very compelling tactic for fraudsters to access data and steal credentials. According to a recent study, very successful phishing campaigns can capture data from 45% of its visitors. And even the least successful campaigns can get capture 3% of its visitors. And if you think about it, that really adds up. I mean, if the fraudster is targeting thousands, anywhere between 3% to 45%, those are still significant numbers where a fraudster is collecting credentials and monetizing on this. So it really, I think with the SAS model, it really emphasizes the fact that we need to start thinking about how we want to have security measures in place and educate the users as well to be responsible for security and protecting data. So on the screen, you'll see two examples. Now, I chose two companies that are pretty different. They're both non-financial industries, and the first, one of the two is basically a non-SAS model where they switched over to a SAS model, and the other is actually was a startup, been really successful. And in both cases, what you'll see is that historically they were never phished, and suddenly they're getting phished like exponentially. They're getting phished a lot. The one thing that we realized that they have in common is once a SaaS company reaches significant market presence, that's where the risk becomes, where it becomes that they become a key target for phishing attacks. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about how consumers get directed to the phishing sites. Well, there are multiple ways, including social media, websites, mobile apps, paid search, and even email. And the key here to emphasize is that fraudsters typically leverage a multi-pronged approach. They don't just use one digital channel, they use multiple digital channels, and they could even be using social engineering tactics. So let's focus on tactics a little bit. There are different ways. So I just talked about I've just mentioned social engineering scams, but there are also email scams, impersonation sites, social media, especially support pages, paid search ads, and malicious mobile apps. So there are lots of different tactics that fraudsters use. For emails, a really effective type of email campaign is where they make it look as legitimate and as real as possible, where they're, taking a company's logo, making it the same look and feel, and making it very targeted and includes an urgent action, call to action. So it could be something like, update your account information now, or it could be like some new activity has been found, or something that will capture a user and make them actually click through and then want to log in without realizing that that's actually a phishing site. On social media sites, just recently, I think it was last week, where we noticed that a fraudster was inserting themselves in a conversation, a support page conversation, and then driving people to take certain actions and directing them to their phishing sites. So the different types of tactics, these are just some examples. Also paid search ads. You'd think that given that they're paid search ads, they would be completely legitimate, but not necessarily the case. Sometimes they would be directing people to phishing URLs. And also, as you can see on the screen, there's a chart, the mobile phishing by industry chart. You can see that 42.28% is targeting the financial services, but there's also a staggering number of non-financial services where phishing is still a tactic leveraged. So I think all in all, it's just really important to think about all the different ways that your business might be vulnerable to these phishing activities. So attacks can happen in different ways, and it's really useful to find out what type of an attack. And this is more for intelligence purposes, but an attack could be a targeted attack where they're specifically going after a company's credentials. It could be a generic attack where it's not targeted necessarily to just one company, but to multiple companies using similar tactics. And it could also be a malware attack where it's not phishing but malware. And it could be either through email campaign attachments or mobile app downloads. So depending on the type of attack, it will have a different impact to your business. If it's a targeting phishing attack, there's higher chance that that is going to directly impact your business revenue. So for example, if your SaaS product is something that could be resold, then, and let's say a fraudster did that, the direct impact of a targeted campaign would be that the fraudsters would resell your product elsewhere, and instead of that money being directed and deposited to the legitimate business, it would be the fraudsters that would be monetizing on this. So on the right-hand side to your screen, you can see a snapshot of a SaaS company. I just took one SaaS company as an example and did a pie chart to break out between the targeted phish, malware, and generic phish attack. And for this particular company, majority was actually generic phishing attack, but there was still a significant percentage that was targeted and also malware related. And for this, different companies tend to take different approaches. Obviously, for me, my general recommendation is if it's any phishing, malware, any fraudulent activities, you want to shut it down and take action. However, I know that there are some companies that prefer to prioritize based on the severity of the threat. So in this case, they might first go with malware and target it, and then later work on the generic phish attacks. But at MarkMonitor, the recommendation would absolutely be any phishing or malware that we would detect, we would absolutely recommend to shut it down ASAP, because ultimately, any fraudulent activities will still have a direct impact to your brand reputation, and it's not safe for your consumer base as well. So here's the question: how do fraudsters monetize? Well, with SaaS, once a fraudster has access to the account, they get access to the data. And then there's a lot of different things that they could be doing. So here are some examples, and obviously it's not limited to these examples that I listed, but a fraudster could be using this to deepen data on users so that they could do a even more targeted campaign, or they could be broadening credential coverage to launch to more people. So think about, for example, if they were a CRM tool and that SaaS company had a ton more contact lists, if a fraudster gets access to it and suddenly gets access to 3,000 or 5,000 more contacts, well, that's more data for them and more targets for them to go after. They could also be monetizing by reselling cloud credentials or even reselling resources. If your SaaS company has a ton of data captured, they could be reselling that information. Also, hijacking and holding people at ransom. Unfortunately, there are these use cases where fraudsters do monetize in those ways. So the impact this has to businesses. Ultimately, with any fraudulent activity, there's going to be some kind of an impact to your business. For starters, it will hurt your online channel, whether that's website or mobile app. Customers will start abandoning those channels, and they won't trust your brand anymore. It also weakens customer relationships, so they might end up going and moving to a competitor of yours, or they'll just also tell all their friends and colleagues that don't use that company, terrible service, and they're always getting phished. Lastly, there's almost so many costs associated with these fraudulent activities, including incident firefighting, fraud remediation, and customer support service. You know, as all these customers are calling in and complaining or, you know, sharing their activities, this obviously raises internal resources and costs. So the bottom line is that this does impact your top and bottom line. So this slide may look familiar. It's a fuller view of one of the first slides you witnessed. So now we kind of talked about examples of the launch campaign, how fraudsters monetize, and what kind of impact this has. But now I actually think it's really important to focus on how are you going to actually address this problem. For me, I think that it's really useful to think about the fraudster's life cycle, online life cycle, because it sets the framework of how you want to think about your protection strategy. So prevention, you want to be able to prevent any fraudulent activities happening. Ideally, that's what you want to be doing. So even before a fraudster can launch their campaign, if you can detect it and shut it down, that's ideal. Also, detect, validate, and mitigate. Immediately shutting down at any point is really what you want to be looking for. So with that, let's focus on talking about considerations and best practices. So whether you are considering to move into a SAS model or if you already operate using a SAS environment, I think that there's certain questions that are really important to continuously ask. Does your cloud product store what might be sensitive business information? Does your cloud store a list of user credentials? Can your cloud product be resold? If so, these are all things that make your product or business a lot more vulnerable, or I should also say more appealing from a fraudster's perspective. You should also assess the potential damage a phishing campaign can have to your customer, and think about the different ways a fraudster would be monetizing. Those are just ways that you could think of proactively what kind of an anti-fraud strategy you want to put in place. And, you know, find out if your brand is getting phished currently or not. If you've always been in an industry where it's been pretty safe and lack of phishing attacks or known fraudulent activities, given the trend line that I showed you in the first few slides, I think that it's legitimate for you to go back and, you know, whether you have technology in place to actually get that assessment, or you could talk to a vendor to see and get a better idea if phishing is truly a problem of yours today. So I highly recommend you do that. And then I think that there's 3 things you should absolutely be doing. First is be proactive with your anti-fraud strategies. You should leverage technologies. If you don't have an in-house purpose-built technology to help you with anti-fraud strategies, then definitely talk to a vendor and definitely think about the fraudster's framework and life cycle, because you definitely want to have some kind of a way to prevent, detect, and mitigate fraudulent activities. Also, don't just focus on one digital channel. And mostly, people tend to focus on the email channel. I think that, especially with fraudsters evolving their tactics and strategies, it's really important to have a multi-pronged approach and also be looking through other digital vectors, including websites, social media, paid search, and mobile apps. And I think that this is really a key takeaway. Educate your customers. Make your customers your allies in fighting fraudulent activities. This is key because, especially in the SAS environment where users are responsible and have power to access data anytime, anywhere, as long as they have internet connection, it's really important to be getting them also educated and on board. I highly recommend you to work with your marketing department, come up with a page where you're educating your customer base on what phishing is about, what malware is about, what are the latest social engineering tactics that you've noticed, what are things that people should be looking out for. Have an education program in place. Also, you can set up an inbox that customers can easily forward any fraudulent scams, and also highly recommend having a two-factor authentication in place. I think that would further secure your business. And last but not least, provide best practices and proactively share. Yeah, I kind of mentioned this with the marketing thing, but, have a proactive best practices and then share that with your customer base so that everyone's in the know. Okay, so to sum everything up, the key takeaways. Cloud computing is changing the way businesses operate and will continue to evolve. And I think that with that said, fraudsters are also continuously evolving their strategy and tactics, so having a preventative measure in place to minimize risks is always important. And also, be prepared for the worst. I hate to sound doom and gloom over here, but be prepared for the worst so that at any stage of the fraud life cycle, you do have a proactive strategy to mitigate and shut down a fraudster. So with that, do you have any questions? I see a few questions coming in. Okay, so let's see. So here's a great question. Can you list some examples of paid search? So actually really interesting. There was a paid search ad that had a legitimate company name with a legitimate URL listed, and everything looked very legitimate. So, especially if you type that company name and that company is doing paid search ads, it will show up. And then if you click on it, most users have this tendency to click on a paid search ad and not double check what the URL link is. And therefore, many people, if it does get directed to a phishing site, miss the fact that the URL has actually totally shifted and is actually indeed a phishing site. So it does happen. It's extraordinarily scary because many people do fall for that kind of a scam. And it's definitely note to yourself that that's something that you should keep an eye out on. Here's another question. Why do you think this attention is being focused on SaaS and cloud services? Yeah, I think that the attention is being focused on SaaS and cloud. There are other industries for sure that fraudsters are proactively starting to engage in, but I think SaaS and cloud is something that we picked up on. Also, and it makes sense because fraudsters tend to go where they know money is being invested, and they know, if someone's making money, if there's a business that's doing really, really well, has a clear market presence, and clearly there's a lot of money to be made, a fraudster will want to, leverage that, and they will want a piece of that pie. So, unfortunately, SaaS is a growing business area, a growing model, and I think fraudsters are now looking into new ways to capitalize on this. Another question. Since you have a PR marketing background, have you seen initiatives by large companies to educate their public, both internal and external, about phishing? how to spot it, report it, etc.? If so, how successful were these campaigns? So, I have definitely seen companies proactively create pages to educate users about fraudulent activities. I haven't actually witnessed a webinar or, campaign, so to speak, but definitely email campaigns I have seen to educate customer bases, whether it's internal and external. I've seen both, and I've also seen websites where they do say that. And then they also have an inbox set up so that people can easily forward information and also share, the latest scams. So I think that effective websites that really work well are those that also include screenshots and real-life examples of the latest scams that's happening. Here's another question. Is there an increasing trend in phishing attacks using mobile apps? Yes, there is an increasing trend in phishing attacks using mobile apps. But I will also caveat saying this, that, I've read a lot of, blogs and articles out there that they're almost making it sound like there's so much of that happening. I think percentage-wise, it's still pretty minimum. However, it is a newer tactic that they're using and finding it effective, so we're seeing more and more of that, and it's definitely growing. However, it's still not like the primary phishing strategy. It's growing, but I think that something like email or websites or there are other channels where it's more primarily focused. However, definitely worth having some kind of mitigation strategy in place because it is growing. Okay, so with that, thank you so much, everyone, for all these great questions. I'll pass it back to Gina.
Great. Thank you, Akino, for such a great presentation. We really appreciate you sharing some best practices for our audience today. I'd like to also thank everyone tuning in for their participation and great questions. Those questions always help us provide more information to those listening in. As a reminder, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the webinar's presentation slides and a recording within the next couple of days. So be on the lookout for that email. That concludes our webinar for today. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a great day.